Welcome back, and thank you for tuning into Cheating Tales Lab. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. We'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop us a comment and let us know. Now let's get into today's story. Matthew Whitehead sat at his polished mahogany desk in the study of his penthouse apartment, completely engrossed in the case files before him. The clock on his desk read 11:45 p.m., but time hardly mattered when there was work to be done. His tailored charcoal suit remained immaculate, untouched by the late hour, no crease or wrinkle in sight. The soft glow of his desk lamp illuminated the stack of documents he was reviewing, casting a quiet glow in the otherwise dim room. The faint sound of expensive fabric signaled Catherine's arrival before she appeared in his study. Matthew didn't look up right away, his pen continuing its steady path across the legal pad before him. Catherine's designer heels clicked on the floor as she walked toward him, each step deliberate and dramatic. "Darling," Catherine's voice oozed with a false sweetness, the kind Matthew had come to recognize as a precursor to something unpleasant. "I have something to share with you." Finally, Matthew lifted his eyes to meet hers. Catherine stood before him in a black designer dress, likely more expensive than most people's monthly salaries. Her perfectly manicured hands were hidden behind her back, and her red lips formed a smile that was anything but genuine. "Since you're so interested in family secrets," she purred, her voice taking on a mocking tone, "here's a big one." With that, she tossed a stack of photographs onto his desk, scattering them across his meticulously arranged papers. Matthew's hand stilled on the legal pad as his eyes fell on the top photo. It showed his father, Frederick, with his arms wrapped around Catherine at a secluded beach house. Their faces were too close, too intimate, their expressions speaking of a connection that should never have existed between a father-in-law and daughter-in-law. "Those father-son fishing trips?" Catherine continued, her voice rising with barely contained satisfaction. "Your dad and I were at our beach house, planning our new life." She placed both hands on the desk and leaned forward, ensuring she had his full attention. "I'm carrying your father's child, and your mother's already decorated the nursery." Matthew's face remained impassive as he picked up one of the photographs. He studied it with the same methodical attention he gave to his legal documents. The date stamp read 3 months ago. He set the photograph down precisely, aligning it with the edge of his desk. "Is that all?" His voice was quiet, controlled, devoid of the shock or anger Catherine had clearly anticipated. Catherine straightened up, her triumphant smile faltering slightly at his lack of reaction. "What do you mean, is that all? I just told you I'm having your father's baby." She grabbed another photo and shoved it toward his face. "Look at these. While you were buried in your precious work, your father and I were building something real." Matthew's dark eyes locked with hers, and something in their depth made Catherine take an instinctive step back. "Your father always liked me better," she continued, though her voice had lost much of its earlier self-assurance. "He said you're boring, always working, never having any fun. You should be more like him." A slight, humorless smile tugged at Matthew's lips, but there was no warmth in it. Without breaking his gaze, he reached for his phone and pressed play on a recording. The sound of Catherine's voice filled the room. "Once we get rid of him, Frederick, everything will be perfect. The fool trusts you completely. He'll never suspect his own father of stealing his company out from under him." Frederick's deeper voice followed. "Matthew's always been too focused on his work to see what's right in front of him. We'll take everything he has, and he'll never see it coming." Catherine's complexion drained of color as the recording continued, revealing a string of conversations where they had plotted and schemed behind Matthew's back. Her hands began to tremble as she grasped the full extent of what she was hearing. "The divorce papers are ready." Matthew's voice was cold, cutting through the tension like a knife. "And Dad's arrest warrant just came through." He stood up slowly, his tall frame looming over her. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't investigate when my own father suddenly started spending so much time with my wife?" Catherine took a stumbling step back, her designer heels catching on the plush carpet. "You," her voice faltered. "You knew?" "All this time," Matthew replied, his tone eerily calm. "I knew the moment I saw you two whispering together at family dinners." Matthew's gaze never wavered. I saw how you both looked at each other when you thought I wasn't watching. Did you enjoy plotting my downfall while sharing my bed?" Catherine's voice cracked, her composure shattering. "Matthew, Save it," he interrupted coldly, walking around the desk with calculated steps. "Every phone call, every meeting, every little scheme you two plotted, I have it all documented. The affair itself is actually the least of your worries." He picked up one of the photographs, studied it for a brief moment, then let it fall back onto the desk with deliberate precision. "Did my father tell you about his dealings with Elias Lutz? About the money laundering? The bribes?" Catherine's face went from pale to ashen. "I don't know what you're talking about." "No." Matthew's smile became colder, sharper. "Funny, because I have recordings of you discussing exactly that with him. Planning how you'd use the evidence to blackmail him if he ever turned on you." He took a step closer, his presence filling the room like a suffocating weight. "You should have been more careful about where you had those conversations, Catherine. Beach houses can be so easily bugged." Catherine's bravado crumbled as she whispered, "You can't do this." Her earlier confidence had completely evaporated. "You'll destroy everything." Matthew returned to his desk, resuming his seat with the same calculated calm he'd exhibited all evening. "That's the point. You and my father wanted to take everything from me. Now, I'm going to take everything from you." He opened his desk drawer with methodical precision, removing a thick envelope. "The divorce papers are on top. The evidence packages for the police are underneath. I suggest you start looking for a good criminal defense lawyer." Catherine's legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed into one of the leather chairs across from his desk. "Please, Matthew," she begged, her voice barely audible. "We can talk about this. We can work something out. Like you and my father worked something out." Matthew's voice held a trace of amusement. "No, Catherine, there's nothing to discuss. You made your choice," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "Now you get to live with the consequences." Catherine's hand instinctively moved to protect her stomach. "What about the baby?" she asked, her voice softer now. "It's your sibling," Matthew replied coldly. "Half-sibling," he corrected with a sharp edge. "And don't worry about the child. I've already arranged for full custody once it's born. Given the evidence I have against both you and my father, no judge will rule in your favor." Her expression twisted with rage as her vulnerability dissolved, revealing the fury beneath. "You heartless bastard. You're just like your father, manipulative, calculating. The difference," Matthew interjected, his tone icy, "is that I don't pretend to be anything else." He leaned back in his chair, his voice firm and final. "Now, get out of my study. My lawyers will contact you in the morning." Catherine stood, her legs trembling, her once perfect designer dress now wrinkled, her flawless makeup streaked by the tears she hadn't realized she shed. She made her way to the door, but paused before leaving, turning back with one last plea. "I loved you once, you know." Matthew didn't lift his eyes from his work. "No, you didn't. You love what I could give you. There's a difference." He picked up his pen, his gesture dismissing her. "Goodbye, Catherine." The sound of her heels echoed as she left the study, followed by the distant, muffled slam of their bedroom door. Matthew didn't flinch. He continued working, his pen gliding across the paper with the same steady precision. The photographs of his wife and father's betrayal lay scattered before him, but they were of no further importance. He had been preparing for this moment for months, gathering evidence, building his case, waiting for one of them to make their move. They had underestimated him, thinking his preoccupation with work made him blind to their schemes. They never suspected that beneath his composed exterior was a mind capable of orchestrating their complete downfall. Matthew reached for his phone once more, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed. It rang twice before being answered. "Blake, move forward with Phase 2. They've made their move." He paused, listening intently to the response. "Yes, everything went exactly as expected. Have the surveillance teams ready to monitor both targets. I want to know every move they make from now until the arrest." He ended the call, leaning back in his chair, allowing himself a brief moment of satisfaction. Catherine and his father had thought they were playing a game of chess. They hadn't realized they were nothing more than pawns in a far larger match, one in which Matthew had been positioning the pieces long before they made their first move. The game was far from over, But tonight's revelation had placed the first major piece exactly where he'd planned. Now, one by one, it was time to topple them all until nothing remained of the empire they had built on lies and betrayal. The law firm was nearly deserted when Matthew arrived the next morning. The early hour ensured his privacy, allowing him to move through the halls undisturbed. His appearance revealed nothing of the confrontation from the previous night. His suit was immaculate, his manner composed, his steps purposeful and deliberate. He closed his office door behind him, the soft click of the lock cutting off the outside world. Inside the quiet sanctuary of his office, he set his briefcase down with practiced care. Within it were copies of every piece of evidence he had meticulously gathered over the past months. Photographs, financial records, recorded conversations. Each item carefully organized, cataloged, and ready to be used. Matthew removed his phone from his pocket and scrolled through his contacts until he found Mindy O'Connor's name. Their friendship had existed long before his marriage to Catherine, long before his rise in the legal world. And now, Mindy would play a key role in the next phase of his plan. If there was anyone Matthew could trust now, it was Mindy. The moment she picked up the phone, he spoke with a controlled urgency. "Mindy, I need to see you right away." Something in his tone must have triggered her response, because she replied without hesitation, "I'll be there in 15 minutes. As he waited, Matthew began to organize the evidence on his desk. Each document, photograph, and recording was part of a larger picture, a timeline of his father's corruption and his wife's betrayal. The pieces fit together seamlessly, revealing a narrative of greed, manipulation, and calculated destruction. Mindy arrived precisely 15 minutes later. She knocked swiftly, and Matthew unlocked the door to let her in. One glance at his face, and she knew something was terribly wrong. "Matthew," she said, closing the door behind her, her voice laced with concern. "What's happened?" He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Mindy. This might take a while." As she seated herself, Matthew remained standing, his hands resting on the back of his chair. "Catherine's having an affair," he began, his voice cold and detached. "With my father." Mindy's sharp intake of breath was the only sound that broke the stillness of the room. "What? Matthew, are you sure?" Without a word, he picked up one of the photographs and handed it to her. Mindy's eyes widened as she absorbed the image of Catherine and Frederick locked in an intimate embrace. "She's pregnant," Matthew continued, his grip tightening on the chair. "With his child. That bitch." Mindy's voice trembled with fury. "I've always hated her, Matthew. I knew she wasn't good enough for you. But this..." Her eyes met his, burning with anger. "How did you find out?" "She told me herself," Matthew answered with a cold smile. "She thought she was delivering the killing blow. What she didn't realize is that I've known about their affair for months." "Months?" Mindy echoed, her shock evident. "You've known for months and didn't say anything?" Matthew finally took a seat, his movements deliberate. "This isn't about emotions, Mindy. It's about strategy." He spread more documents across the desk, revealing the depth of his preparation. "While they were plotting to destroy me, I was gathering evidence. Not just of their affair, but of everything. Everything." Mindy leaned forward, her legal mind kicking into gear as she began to scan the documents. "I hired Blake Sweeney 3 months ago," Matthew explained, referring to the private investigator renowned for his precision. "He's been tracking their every move, recording their conversations, following the money trail." He pulled out a thick file, flipping it open to reveal detailed financial records. "My father's been taking bribes from Elias Lutz. He's been laundering money through shell companies, using company assets for his own personal gain. Every transaction, every meeting, every phone call. It's all documented." Mindy's eyes grew wide as she processed the enormity of what Matthew was showing her. "This is... Matthew, this is enough to destroy them both. That's the point." His voice was cold and steady. "They wanted to take everything from me," he continued, standing up again and moving toward the window that overlooked the city. "Instead, I'm going to take everything from them." He turned back to face her, the weight of his words settling in. "The divorce papers are already prepared. The evidence has been organized for the prosecutors. By this time next week, My father will face criminal charges, and Catherine will have nothing left, Matthew stated coldly. Mindy immediately offered her unwavering support. What do you need from me? Matthew turned his gaze back to her. I need someone I can trust. Someone who understands the law as well as I do and won't hesitate to help me destroy them. You have me, Mindy replied without hesitation. Whatever you need, I'm here. Matthew's lips curled into a faint, approving smile. Good. He returned to his desk and pulled out another file. This is just the beginning. Blake's discovered connections between my father and other corrupt officials. Once we start pulling at these threads, the entire network will unravel. He spread the documents before her, revealing a complex, tangled web of corruption and deceit. We're not just bringing down my father and Catherine. We're going to dismantle everything they've built. Every person they've worked with, every shady deal, every illegal transaction. They're all going to be exposed. Mindy's sharp mind immediately began calculating the consequences. The fallout from this is going to be massive. Let it be, Matthew replied, his voice firm and unwavering. They thought I was weak. They thought I was too focused on my work to notice what was happening around me. They mistook my patience for passivity, my precision for weakness. He met Mindy's eyes, the cold determination in his gaze unmistakable. I'm going to show them how wrong they were. Before they could discuss further, a knock at the door interrupted them. Matthew swiftly gathered the papers and placed them in his briefcase, securing them out of sight. He opened the door to find his secretary standing there, informing him that his first client of the day had arrived. We'll continue this later, Matthew told Mindy as she stood to leave. Come to my office after hours. We've got a lot of work to do. Mindy nodded in understanding, making her way to the door. Before leaving, she paused and turned back to him. Matthew, they deserve everything that's coming to them, she said, her voice tinged with certainty. Matthew's lips twitched into a cold smile. Yes, they do, and they're going to get it. Every last bit of it. As she exited, Matthew straightened his tie and prepared for his client meeting. To anyone else, he appeared as professional and composed as always, calm, controlled, focused on his work. They wouldn't see the fury smoldering beneath his exterior, the cold, calculated anger that was about to tear apart the lives of those who had betrayed him. The game had begun, and Matthew was determined to not only win, but to annihilate. His father and Catherine had taught him a valuable lesson. Never trust anyone completely. It was a lesson he planned to repay, with interest. Sitting at his desk, Matthew reviewed the latest report from Blake Sweeney. The private investigator had exceeded his expectations, compiling a comprehensive dossier on Frederick's web of corruption, one that went far deeper than Matthew had ever imagined. The corruption stretched through City Hall, with tentacles reaching into various government departments and private enterprises. As he was absorbed in the details, a soft knock came at his door. Come in, he called, knowing exactly who it would be. Terry Wilson, his father's personal assistant, entered the office quietly, her movements betraying a clear sense of unease. Dressed in a simple black suit, her professional demeanor was tempered by a nervousness that she couldn't quite mask. Please, sit down, Terry, Matthew said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. As she settled herself into the seat, he studied her carefully, noticing the slight tremor in her hands and how she struggled to meet his gaze. I received your message, she murmured softly, her voice barely audible. You said it was urgent. Matthew leaned forward, his expression serious, but not without a hint of understanding. Terry, I know everything. The color drained from her face, but before she could respond, he held up a hand to stop her. I know about the offshore accounts, he continued, his voice calm and measured. I know about the meetings with Elias Lutz, the bribes, the shell companies. I know how my father has manipulated you, using your job security as leverage to involve you in his schemes. Terry's hands gripped her handbag tightly, her knuckles turning white. How? How did you find out? She stammered. Matthew opened a folder on his desk, revealing photographs and documents. I've been watching, Terry, he said simply. For months. I know you've been documenting everything, keeping your own records. He paused, studying her reaction carefully. Smart move, by the way. Always good to have insurance. Terry looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and surprise. Mr. Whitehead, Matthew, she corrected herself. Please, if my father finds out I've been keeping records, he won't hurt you. Matthew's voice hardened with a firmness that was unmistakable. I can protect you, Terry. You can help me put an end to this, to his reign. Her gaze flickered toward him, uncertainty still clouding her expression. What kind of protection? Complete immunity from prosecution, Matthew replied without hesitation. A new position at a different firm, better pay, better working conditions. I can offer you a fresh start. Terry, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze never wavering. All you have to do is testify about what you've seen and provide me access to the records I know you've been keeping. Terry opened her mouth as if to speak, but her voice faltered. You don't understand, Matthew. It's not just your father. Elias Lutz, his connections, they're powerful people. Matthew's demeanor remained steady. I understand perfectly, he said, his tone unwavering. Let me show you something. He stood and moved to his laptop, opening it and playing a series of recordings. Terry's eyes widened as she listened to Frederick's voice discussing illegal deals, heard Elias Lutz arranging bribes, and even recognized her own voice in the background as she quietly took notes during their meetings. I have everything, Terry, Matthew said quietly, his words firm but edged with empathy. Every meeting, every transaction, every threat, including the times my father threatened you, made you fear for your job, your safety. Terry's breath hitched as she absorbed the gravity of what was unfolding before her. I can protect you from all of it, Matthew continued, his voice softening just slightly. But I need your help. For a long moment, Terry was silent, her fingers nervously twisting in her lap. Finally, she reached in her handbag and pulled out a small USB drive. I've been keeping records for 3 years, she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper, but there was a newfound resolve in it. Copies of every document, every transaction, audio recordings of meetings, photos of documents before they were shredded. Matthew took the USB drive from her carefully, his fingers brushing hers for a moment. Why did you start keeping records? He asked, his voice quieter now, more curious than anything. Terry looked up at him, her gaze steady but filled with the weight of years spent in fear. The first time I saw your father take a bribe from Mr. Lutz, she said, her voice strengthening slightly, I knew I couldn't just sit back and let it happen. I had to protect myself, somehow. Terry's voice trembled but grew steadier as she continued. He made me falsify the accounting records to hide it. I knew someday someone would uncover the truth. Matthew nodded with quiet approval. Smart move, he said, his tone acknowledging her foresight. He inserted the USB drive into his laptop and began sifting through the files. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the documents, his brow furrowing in concentration. This is even more extensive than I thought, he muttered. Your father? He trusts me because he thinks I'm weak, Terry explained, her voice now gaining strength. He never imagined I'd dare to document anything, but I've seen everything. The deals with Lutz, the money laundering, the threats against other business owners. And now he's going to pay for that mistake. Matthew's expression turned cold. Good. It's about time. He looked at her then, his gaze intense. Are you ready to testify about all of this? Terry straightened in her chair, the usual timidness gone. A glimmer of resolve sparked in her eyes. Yes, it's time someone stopped them. Matthew gave a small nod of approval. Good. He stood up and walked toward the office door, locking it with a deliberate motion. Let's go through everything you have. I want to know every detail, every transaction, every conversation. Leave nothing out. For the next several hours, Terry walked Matthew through her extensive documentation. She recounted how Frederick had methodically constructed his empire of corruption, using threats and bribes to silence his opposition, with Elias Lutz providing the political muscle in exchange for kickbacks and favors. As this was unfolding, across town, Frederick Whitehead sat comfortably in his opulent office, blissfully unaware of the tightening net around him. He was on the phone with Elias Lutz, the conversation casual, with an air of assuredness. The merger's going through next week, Frederick said, leaning back in his leather chair. Once it's complete, we'll control the entire harbor development project. Excellent. Lutz's voice crackled through the speaker. The zoning changes will be approved by then. No one will ask any questions. Perfect, Frederick said, a satisfied smile crossing his face. Matthew's been too busy with his cases to pay attention to any of this. Sometimes I wonder if that boy has any business sense at all. Lutz's voice took on a more cautious tone. Speaking of Matthew, have you heard from Catherine today? Frederick's smile faltered slightly, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. No, why? Just checking. She seemed a bit agitated when I saw her at the club this morning. Women's problems, no doubt. Frederick dismissed it with a wave of his hand. Nothing to worry about. Everything's proceeding exactly as planned. As he ended the call, he leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the way things were progressing. What he didn't realize, however, was that his empire was on the verge of collapsing. His arrogance, his overconfidence in dismissing his son as too absorbed in his work to notice what was happening around him, had led him to create too many enemies and leave too many loose ends. Matthew had been quietly gathering all the threads, and now he was ready to pull them all at once. Meanwhile, Catherine sat in her favorite spa, attempting to maintain her usual calm facade, but a growing sense of panic gnawed at her chest. She tried calling Frederick several times, but he'd been dismissive, too consumed with his own affairs to address her concerns. Her hand rested protectively over her stomach as she reflected on Matthew's cold demeanor, his calculated response to her revelation. She had expected him to break down, to give her the emotional reaction she craved. But instead, he had turned the situation completely around, and now she was still reeling from the shock. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her lawyer, informing her that the divorce papers had been officially filed. Attached was a preliminary list of evidence that would be presented in court. Catherine's hand trembled as she scrolled through the document, the full weight of Matthew's meticulous preparation sinking in. For the first time, she realized how thoroughly he had documented everything. As the sun set over the city, 3 people sat in different locations, each oblivious to the imminent collapse of their world. Frederick sat in his office, comfortably ensconced in the security of his power and the corruption that sustained it. Catherine, meanwhile, attempted to maintain her carefully constructed facade of control in the quiet of her spa. And Matthew, methodical and determined, sat in his law office with Terry, meticulously assembling the case that would dismantle everything his father and wife had built. The first phase of Matthew's plan was nearing its end, but the true drama had only just begun. He had carefully laid the groundwork, positioning every piece with precision. Now, all that remained was to watch as each one fell, one after another, until nothing was left of the corrupt empire Frederick had constructed, or the life Catherine had tried to claim as her own. By the following morning, the headlines exploded across every major news outlet. Business mogul Frederick William under investigation for corruption. The story dominated the front pages, accompanied by photographs of Frederick at various charity events and business functions, his once confident smile now taking on an ominous edge in light of the allegations. In his office at the law firm, Matthew watched the unfolding chaos on multiple screens. Each news channel covered the story from a different angle, but the core of the narrative remained unchanged. One of the city's most influential businessmen was accused of corruption, bribery, and fraud on a massive scale. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages and calls, but Matthew ignored them all, his focus unwavering. He studied the financial reports streaming across his computer screen, observing in real time as his father's company's stock price tumbled. The familiar sense of satisfaction stirred within him. A knock at the door interrupted his moment of quiet triumph. Blake Sweeney entered, carrying a thick folder. "The investors are pulling out exactly as we predicted," Blake said, his voice as dry and precise as ever. "The major shareholders called an emergency meeting for this afternoon." Matthew nodded without a hint of emotion. "Your father's scrambling to do damage control, but it's too late," Blake continued. "Nobody's buying his spin?" "And Lutz?" Matthew asked, not shifting his gaze from the screen. Blake's lip curled slightly in response. His office issued a statement denying any connection to your father. "But we've already leaked the recordings to 3 major news outlets." They'll break the story within the hour. Good, Matthew said, his tone hardening with resolve. What about Catherine? Blake placed several surveillance photos on Matthew's desk. She's at the Ritz-Carlton, hasn't left her room since yesterday. She's called your father 17 times. He hasn't answered a single one. Matthew raised an eyebrow. And the business associates? She's tried contacting them too, Blake replied. None of them will take her calls. A faint smile played at the corners of Matthew's lips. They're already distancing themselves. Rats deserting a sinking ship. His phone buzzed again. Another call from Frederick. Matthew let it go to voicemail, just as he had done with the previous 12 calls. He had no intention of speaking to his father until the man was completely cornered. Blake hesitated before speaking again. There's something else, sir. Your mother called the office this morning. Matthew's expression hardened. I thought I made it clear. No contact. His voice was icy, the finality in it unmistakable. Blake held his gaze, but said nothing more. Blake's voice was steady as he clarified. She wasn't trying to reach you, sir. She was calling to provide information. Apparently, your father's been moving assets into offshore accounts for years. Matthew's interest peaked at once. What kind of records? He asked sharply. Bank statements, transfer documents, and correspondence with foreign banks. She's been collecting evidence since before your marriage to Catherine, Blake explained. Matthew leaned back in his chair, his mind racing as he absorbed this new development. His mother, always seemingly unaware of Frederick's machinations, might have been playing a much longer game than he had ever imagined. Perhaps she had known more than she let on, quietly collecting information while maintaining the appearance of ignorance. Get everything she has, Matthew instructed, his voice low and purposeful. But keep your distance. I don't want any personal contact, just yet. Blake nodded, collecting his papers. Understood. Matthew's thoughts shifted, the weight of this new piece of the puzzle settling heavily on him. But Blake's voice interrupted again. One more thing, sir. Elias Lutz is scheduled to appear at a press conference in an hour. Word is he's going to publicly sever ties with your father. Matthew's lips curled into a slight smile. Perfect. Turning back to his screens, Matthew's voice was steady. Make sure the media gets those photos of them at the beach house before Lutz steps up to the podium. Blake nodded once more, leaving the room with the urgency of his task. Matthew's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the press release he had prepared weeks earlier. It was now ready to be sent out. His law firm would launch an internal investigation into any cases potentially compromised by Frederick Williams' alleged corruption. It was a brilliant piece of misdirection. On the surface, it appeared to be a call for justice, positioning Matthew as a moral crusader. But in reality, it was part of his strategy to discredit his father and his mother while elevating his own position. Across town, in his office, Frederick Williams paced, his usual composure slipping as the pressure mounted. His phone, abandoned on his desk, was filled with messages and missed calls from business partners, political allies, and social connections, all demanding explanations he was unable to give. Get me Matthew, Frederick barked at his new assistant, his voice strained. Terry had called in sick, a betrayal he hadn't anticipated. I don't care how you do it, just get him on the phone. The assistant's voice trembled slightly. Sir, your son's office says he's in meetings all day. They won't put any calls through. Frederick slammed his fist on the desk, the sound echoing through the office. Then give me Catherine. She started this mess. She can help fix it. Mrs. Whitehead isn't accepting calls, sir, the assistant said, hesitating. And there's something else? The assistant handed Frederick a tablet, and the color drained from his face as he looked at the screen. There it was. Photos of him with Catherine at the beach house, his secret getaway, now laid bare for the world to see. The timestamp on the photos perfectly matched the business trips he had claimed to be taking, the board meetings he said he was attending. His phone buzzed again. Another business partner had pulled out of a deal. The empire he had spent decades building was crumbling. The weight of it hit him like a physical blow, and for the first time in his life, Frederick William felt real, visceral fear. Meanwhile, at the Ritz-Carlton, Catherine sat in her opulent suite, watching as the world she had built for herself collapsed before her eyes on multiple news channels. Her phone had finally stopped ringing. There was no one left to contact. Frederick wouldn't answer. Her friends had cut ties, and even her family had sent a terse message asking her to stay away until the scandal died down. She placed a hand on her stomach, the child growing within her, the child that had once seemed like her ticket to a better life. Now, it felt more like an anchor, dragging her deeper into the nightmare she had helped create. A notification flashed on her phone. It was breaking news. Catherine's hand trembled as she clicked the notification, her breath catching in her throat. On the screen, a photograph of her and Frederick at their beach house appeared, his hand possessively resting on her waist, both of them laughing, caught in a moment of intimacy that had once been her secret escape. The headline above it read, "Scandal Deepens. Business mogul's affair with son's wife exposed." Her world seemed to shatter in that instant. She ran to the bathroom, barely making it before she was violently ill. When she emerged, pale and shaking, her phone buzzed in her hand. 3 missed calls from her divorce attorney. She didn't need to return the call to know what was coming. With the release of these photos, any hope she had of a favorable settlement was gone. Her future, carefully constructed, was now as fragile as glass, and it seemed to crack under the weight of the exposure. In his law firm office, Matthew watched the chaos unfold on multiple screens, his expression devoid of emotion. Every detail, every reaction was playing out exactly as he had planned. His father's desperate calls, Catherine's isolation, Lutz's attempt to distance himself. All of it had been meticulously calculated. Blake's phone buzzed with another update. "Sir, Lutz is about to take the podium." Matthew turned up the volume on one of his screens, watching as Elias Lutz approached the microphone. The political veteran's usual confident swagger was conspicuously absent. Before he could speak, every major news outlet updated their feeds with the new photos. Lutz and Frederick at the beach house, unmistakably visible in the background of Frederick and Catherine's affair. Lutz faltered at the podium, his eyes wide with shock as his aide whispered urgently in his ear. The statement of denial he had prepared now seemed utterly useless. His carefully crafted public image was crumbling before the world's eyes. Matthew allowed himself a small smile. By the end of the day, every major player in his father's corrupt empire would be exposed. Their frantic attempts to save themselves would only serve to incriminate each other further. He picked up his phone and dialed Mindy's extension. "It's time for phase 2. Get the legal team ready." The arrest warrant had been executed with precision at exactly 9 a.m. Frederick William, despite his wealth and influence, was let out of his office building in handcuffs. His tailored suit did little to preserve his dignity as photographers captured every humiliating moment. Matthew watched the arrest unfold on his screen, his expression unreadable as his father was placed into the back of a police car. Beside him, Mindy reviewed the latest documents from the prosecutor's office. "They're offering a deal," she said, her tone as professional as ever despite the personal stakes of the case. "If he pleads guilty to the major charges, they'll drop some of the lesser ones." "No deals," Matthew responded coldly. "We have enough evidence to convict him on every charge. I want him to face the maximum sentence possible." Mindy nodded, her face reflecting the quiet anticipation of this decision. "The DA's office also wants to know if you'll testify." "Unnecessary," Matthew replied, his voice steady. "Terry's testimony, combined with the financial records and recordings, is more than enough. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I think it will hurt him more to know I didn't even consider him worth confronting in person." His phone buzzed again, another update from Blake. "Sir, they've just arrested Lutz. It's all over the news." Matthew switched screens, watching as Elias Lutz was led out of his campaign office in handcuffs. His political career was being destroyed in real time as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Lutz's face, once so composed, now reflected a mix of fury and disbelief, his public image crumbling with every step he took toward the waiting police car. The fall of Frederick, Lutz, and the others was swift, but to Matthew, it was merely the culmination of a plan long in motion. The end of the empire was now inevitable. His wife's already contacting divorce attorneys, Blake continued. And the party leadership is releasing a statement distancing themselves from him. They're calling for a special election to fill his seat. Good, Matthew replied, turning his attention back to the computer. Make sure his connection to the harbor development project is emphasized in the next news cycle. I want every business deal they touch to be scrutinized. A knock at his office door interrupted him. His secretary entered, visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Whitehead, your mother is here. She's demanding to see you." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Tell her I'm in meetings all day. She says she has more documents." "About the offshore accounts?" After a moment of consideration, Matthew nodded. "Send her to conference room 3. Mindy, would you handle it? Get whatever information she has, but make no promises." As Mindy left to meet with his mother, Matthew refocused on the unfolding crisis. Catherine had finally emerged from her hotel room, and the paparazzi were taking full advantage of the situation. Photos of her trying to shield her face from the cameras were flooding the internet, her designer clothes and expensive accessories now casting her in the light of greed and betrayal. Her lawyer had made another attempt at negotiation, suggesting that Catherine's pregnancy might generate public sympathy. Matthew had responded by releasing the recordings of Catherine and Frederick, plotting to take control of the company. Any potential sympathy evaporated as people listened to her cold, calculated planning and her gleeful destruction of her husband. "She's been admitted to the hospital," Blake reported, placing a medical report on Matthew's desk. "Stress-related complications with the pregnancy." Matthew glanced at the report without any change in expression. "Have someone monitor the situation. I want to know immediately if anything changes with the child's condition." "Already arranged?" Blake hesitated before continuing. "Sir, there's something else. We found evidence that your father had been planning this for years. The beach house, the affair with Catherine, it was all part of a larger scheme to take control of your shares in the company." "Show me?" Blake pulled out another file, this one containing emails dating back to before Matthew's marriage to Catherine. The emails revealed a calculated plan. Frederick had orchestrated the initial meeting between Matthew and Catherine, encouraged their relationship, all while grooming her to be his lover and co-conspirator. "Your father knew that if you died without an heir, your shares would revert to him," Blake explained. "There are discussions about arranging an accident once Catherine was pregnant." Matthew absorbed the information with the same cold detachment he had shown throughout the ordeal. "Add it to the evidence for the prosecution," Matthew instructed. "And Blake, make sure my mother sees these emails. I want her to understand exactly what kind of man she was married to." As the day unfolded, the fallout continued to intensify. Business partners scrambled to cooperate with authorities, each hoping to protect themselves by providing incriminating evidence against Frederick and Lutz. The company's stock price plummeted further as more details of the corruption came to light. In his prison cell, Frederick Williams sat on the narrow bed, watching helplessly as his empire crumbled. The small television in the corner was his only window to the outside world. His calls for top criminal defense attorneys had been met with polite refusals. No one wanted to be associated with such a toxic case. Catherine remained hospitalized, isolated, and under constant supervision. Her family had issued a statement expressing their shock and disappointment at her actions, effectively cutting her off from her last potential support system. Matthew moved through it all with methodical precision, ensuring each new piece of evidence was properly documented and filed, each statement carefully crafted to tighten the noose around his father's neck. He showed no signs of the personal toll this might have been taking on him, no indication that destroying his family had any emotional impact. The hospital corridor was eerily quiet as Matthew approached Catherine's room. He waited until visiting hours were nearly over, ensuring their conversation would be private. 2 security guards, his own, not hospital staff, stood outside her door. Catherine lay in the bed, monitors beeping steadily around her. She looked smaller, somehow, her designer hospital gown and carefully applied makeup unable to hide her deteriorating condition. When Matthew entered, her eyes widened, a mixture of hope and fear crossing her face. "Matthew," her voice was hoarse. "You came. Don't misunderstand," he replied, staying near the door. "This isn't a personal visit. We need to discuss the terms of your surrender." Catherine's hand instinctively moved to protectively cover her stomach. "Surrender? What are you talking about?" Matthew pulled out his phone, scrolling through documents. "Your lawyers are still trying to negotiate a settlement. That ends now. You'll sign the divorce papers as they are, relinquishing all claims to my assets and property. You'll provide a full statement to the prosecutors about your involvement in my father's schemes. And you'll agree to terminate your parental rights once the child is born. You can't be serious. Catherine struggled to sit up, her face filled with disbelief. This is your sibling. Your own blood. Half-sibling, Matthew corrected coldly. The product of my wife's affair with my father. A child conceived as part of a plot to murder me and steal my company. He glanced up from his phone, his expression hardening. Did you really think I wouldn't find out about that part? The color drained from Catherine's face as she stammered. I don't know what you're talking about. Matthew played another recording. Catherine's voice, discussing with Frederick the possibility of Matthew having an accident once the pregnancy was confirmed. You see, Matthew said, his voice eerily calm. That's the difference between us, Catherine, Matthew said, his voice as cold as ever. You and my father plotted and schemed, but you were sloppy. You got caught up in your own cleverness, your own sense of superiority. You never imagined I might be playing a longer game. Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, I gave you everything, Matthew. My youth, my beauty, my devotion. You gave me nothing. Matthew cut her off, his tone unyielding. Everything you did was calculated. Every moment of our marriage was a lie. You were my father's creature from the beginning. He chose you, groomed you, positioned you in my life. And you played your part perfectly, didn't you? The loving wife, so supportive of my career, so understanding of my long hours at work. All while you plotted my death with my own father. Catherine's hands twisted in the hospital sheets. It wasn't like that. Not at first. I did love you. The papers, Matthew interrupted, placing a thick envelope on her bed. Sign them now, or I release the murder plot evidence to the media. Your choice. You wouldn't. Catherine's voice shook with disbelief. The scandal would hurt you too. Matthew smiled, and there was something chilling in his expression. Catherine, look around you. I've already destroyed my father's business empire, exposed his corruption, and had him arrested. I've ruined Elias Lutz's political career and implicated half the city's business elite in a corruption scandal. Do you really think I care about a little more negative publicity? He moved closer to the bed, his presence overwhelming in the small room. Sign the papers, Catherine. End this now, or I will destroy what's left of your reputation so thoroughly that even your own family won't acknowledge your existence. Catherine's hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. What happens to the baby? My lawyers have already arranged everything, Matthew replied, his voice cold and indifferent. The child will be placed with a suitable family, far from this mess you and my father created. You'll have no contact, no rights, no connection of any kind. Catherine whispered, her voice filled with despair. You're a monster. No, Matthew corrected her. I'm just better at this game than you and my father were. You taught me an important lesson, Catherine. Never trust anyone completely. It's a lesson I'll make sure you never forget. As Catherine signed page after page, her tears falling onto the documents, Matthew watched with the same detached interest he might show a mildly engaging legal brief. When she finished, he collected the papers without a word. We're done here, he said, sliding the papers into his briefcase. My lawyers will handle any remaining details. Wait, Catherine called out as he turned to leave. What about your mother? Does she know everything? Matthew paused at the door, his expression unreadable. My mother provided evidence against Frederick going back years. Those offshore accounts you thought were so well hidden? She's been tracking them since before I met you. Catherine's face crumpled as the realization set in. So, everyone was playing their own game. Everyone except me. That's where you're wrong. Matthew's voice held no sympathy. You played your game. You just played it poorly. He opened the door. Goodbye, Catherine. Don't try to contact me again. Matthew. Her voice rose desperately. What am I supposed to do now? Where am I supposed to go? He turned back one final time, his expression as cold as ever. That's not my concern. You chose your path when you conspired with my father. Now you get to walk it alone. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Catherine alone in her hospital room. Outside, Matthew handed the signed documents to one of his security team. Take these directly to Mindy, he instructed. "And maintain surveillance on this room. I want to know if anyone tries to contact her." His phone buzzed with another message from Blake. Frederick had been demanding to see him, offering to reveal everything in exchange for leniency. Matthew deleted the message without a second thought. His father's desperation was merely another sign that everything was proceeding precisely as planned. As he drove, Matthew reviewed the day's developments. His father was in jail, Lutz's career was in ruins, and Catherine was isolated and defeated. Each piece had fallen exactly where he'd intended. The media, focusing on the corruption angle, was painting Matthew as the honest lawyer who had exposed a vast web of deceit, rather than as the ruthless son destroying his own family. He opened his laptop and began drafting the press release that would accompany Catherine's signed confession. By morning, the last remnants of his father's empire would be shattered, and everyone who had betrayed him would understand the full consequences of their actions. His phone buzzed, Mindy calling with updates from the legal team. More evidence had surfaced, and more former associates of his father were turning state's evidence to save themselves. Matthew listened with satisfaction. The tide hadn't just turned. It had become a tsunami, washing away everything his father and Catherine had built on their foundation of lies and betrayal. Closing his laptop, his expression resolute, Matthew knew Phase 2 was complete. The trap had sprung perfectly, leaving his enemies broken and isolated. Now, it was time to ensure their destruction was total and irreversible. There would be no chance of recovery, no possibility of redemption. He had promised them annihilation, and Matthew Whitehead always kept his promises. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Frederick Williams stood to hear the verdict. His expensive suit, once a symbol of his power, now hung loosely on his frame after months in custody. Behind him, the gallery was packed with reporters, former business associates, and curious onlookers, all eager to witness the final act of his downfall. Matthew sat in the front row, his expression impassive as the jury foreman stood. He had attended every day of the trial, watching as the evidence he had meticulously gathered was presented piece by piece. Each witness told their part of the story. Terry Wilson's detailed account of the corruption, former business partners turning against Frederick to save themselves, and financial experts tracking the money through offshore accounts. On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. On the count of tax evasion? Guilty. On the count of bribery? Guilty. Each verdict landed like a hammer blow. Frederick's shoulders sagged further with each pronouncement, his carefully maintained facade of confidence finally crumbling. In the defendant's section, Elias Lutz sat with his legal team, his political career already in tatters. He tried to distance himself from Frederick, but the evidence was too overwhelming. His own trial would begin the following week, but today's verdicts had sealed his fate. The judge's voice cut through the murmurs. "Frederick William, you have been found guilty of serious crimes against the public trust. Your actions have demonstrated a complete disregard for the law and a pattern of corruption that spans decades." Matthew watched his father's face as the judge continued. "Taking into account the severity and duration of your crimes, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of..." The number that followed marked the complete collapse of Frederick's financial empire. Every asset would be seized, every account emptied, and every property sold. The man who had once commanded boardrooms would now spend his remaining years behind bars. As the bailiffs approached to take Frederick away, he turned to look at Matthew. For the first time, there was a hint of respect in his eyes, a grudging acknowledgement that his son had outplayed him completely. "Matthew," Frederick called out. "Son." Matthew stood and gathered his briefcase, ignoring his father's attempt at communication. He had no interest in whatever Frederick might want to say. No last-minute confessions or attempts at reconciliation would change anything. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed around Matthew. "Mr. Whitehead, how do you feel about your father's conviction? What are your plans for the company now? Do you have any comment on Catherine Prince's condition?" Matthew faced the cameras with practiced composure. "Justice has been served. The evidence spoke for itself. I have no further comment." Later that day, in his office, Mindy brought in the latest updates. "Catherine lost the baby," she said quietly, placing the medical report on his desk. The doctors say the stress was too much. Matthew nodded, accepting the information without a visible reaction. Make sure she receives proper medical care, he instructed. Whatever else she's done, I won't have her death on my conscience. She's asking to see you again. No. Matthew's voice was firm. The divorce is final. There's nothing left to discuss. His phone buzzed with a message from Blake. The private investigator had been monitoring the fallout from the verdicts. Former business partners were scrambling to distance themselves from Frederick and Lutz, desperate to avoid being caught in ongoing investigations. The DA's office wants to know if you'll make a statement at your father's formal sentencing next week. Blake's message read. Mindy reviewed her notes. Not necessary. The evidence did all the talking that needed to be done. Matthew turned to his computer, pulling up the latest reports on the company's reorganization. What's the status of the audit? The forensic accountants have traced most of the missing funds. They're recommending a complete restructuring of the board and executive team. Matthew nodded, satisfied. The company would survive, cleansed of his father's corruption. He'd already begun implementing new oversight measures to ensure nothing like this could happen again. A knock at the door interrupted them. Matthew's secretary entered with another update. Catherine has been released from the hospital. She's moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. All her former friends and social connections have abandoned her. Her family is still refusing contact, the secretary added, and the press is camped outside her building. Increase her security detail, Matthew instructed. I don't want her doing anything desperate. Make sure she has whatever medical care she needs, but maintain distance. No direct contact. The day continued with a steady stream of updates and reports. Frederick's conviction had triggered a cascade of investigations throughout the business community. Former associates were turning on one another, each trying to save themselves as authorities uncovered more connections to the corruption. Mindy stayed late, helping Matthew sort through the chaos. Your mother called again, she mentioned carefully. She wants to meet. Matthew paused in his work, considering. His mother had provided crucial evidence against Frederick, proving she had been documenting his crimes for years. She had played her own long game, waiting for the right moment to strike. Not yet, he decided. There were still too many loose ends to tie up. As night fell over the city, Matthew stood by his office window, surveying the empire he had reclaimed. His father was headed to prison. His wife was isolated and broken, and everyone who had conspired against him had been destroyed. He had achieved exactly what he had set out to do. Yet there was no satisfaction in the victory, no sense of triumph. Only a cold certainty that he had done what was necessary, that he had shown everyone the cost of betrayal. His phone buzzed one final time, another message from the prison. Frederick was still requesting a meeting, still trying to explain himself. Matthew deleted the message without reading it. Some betrayals ran too deep for explanations. Some wounds could never be healed. He returned to his desk and continued working. There were still details to handle, loose ends to tie up. The company needed restructuring. The investigations were ongoing, and he had to ensure that every trace of his father's corruption was eliminated. The decision to meet with his mother came 3 months after Frederick's conviction. The restaurant Matthew chose was private, discreet, far from the media's prying eyes. Elizabeth Whitehead arrived precisely on time, her elegant appearance masking the strain of the recent months. Matthew, she said softly as she sat down, thank you for agreeing to see me. He studied her carefully, noting the new lines around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. You took a significant risk collecting evidence against him all those years. I had to protect you, Elizabeth replied. Your father, I saw what he was becoming, what he was capable of. When he started grooming Catherine, I knew I had to act. You could have warned me. Would you have believed me? She met his gaze steadily. Frederick had you convinced he was the perfect father, the successful businessman showing his son the ropes. If I tried to tell you the truth then, he would have turned you against me completely. Matthew couldn't argue with her logic. His younger self had idolized Frederick, believing every carefully crafted lie. Why did you stay with him so long? To gather evidence. Elizabeth's voice hardened slightly. To build a case so strong, he couldn't possibly escape it. I knew eventually he'd make a mistake, become too confident. When he started the affair with Catherine, I knew that was my chance. Their conversation was interrupted by the waiter bringing drinks. When they were alone again, Elizabeth leaned forward. "I want you to know, I'm proud of how you handled everything. You showed strength I wasn't sure you had. I learned from watching both of you," Matthew replied coolly. "You and Frederick. You both taught me the importance of patience, of playing the long game." "We did," Elizabeth acknowledged. "But you surpassed both your teachers." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I've been thinking about the future, about rebuilding our relationship." Matthew studied his drink, considering. His mother had proven herself an ally, had helped bring down Frederick. But trust didn't come easily to him anymore. "It will take time," he said finally. "I understand." Elizabeth reached into her bag and withdrew a file. "I have something for you. Evidence of further corruption within Frederick's old business circle. People who hadn't yet been caught." This caught Matthew's attention. "You're still investigating?" he asked. "Always," Elizabeth replied, a small smile crossing her face. "Old habits die hard. Besides," she added, "someone needs to make sure nothing like this happens again." Later that day, back at his office, Mindy found him reviewing the files his mother had provided. "How did it go?" she asked, setting a coffee on his desk. "She's more like him than I realized," Matthew replied. "Just as calculating, just as patient. She just picked a different target. Does that bother you?" "No," he closed the file, looking up at Mindy. "It makes me respect her more. She played her role perfectly, gathered her evidence, and struck at exactly the right moment." Mindy sat down across from him. "I've been thinking about what you said about creating a foundation to help victims of corporate fraud. I think it's a good idea." Matthew nodded. "People need to know they have options, that they don't have to remain victims. Like Terry," she added. "She could have stayed silent, kept taking his abuse. Instead, she documented everything, prepared for the day someone would finally act. You gave her that chance," Mindy pointed out. "You protected her, made sure she was safe. And now we can do the same for others." Matthew pulled up a document on his computer. "I've already started the paperwork. The foundation will provide legal support, protection, and resources for whistleblowers." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Blake with his final report. The private investigator had been monitoring the aftermath of Frederick's conviction, tracking the ripple effects through the business community. "Most of his old associates have gone to ground," Blake reported. "The ones who haven't been arrested are trying to hide their connections, destroy evidence." "Let them try," Matthew replied, gesturing toward his mother's files. "We have what we need to find them." The conversation shifted to more practical matters, setting up the foundation, reorganizing the company, and planning for the future. Matthew remained focused, methodical, showing the same attention to detail that had helped him dismantle his father's empire. Later that evening, as the office began to empty, Mindy lingered. She had been by his side through everything, loyal, supportive, never questioning his methods or his motives. "You know," she said carefully, "it's okay to feel something about all this. About Frederick, Catherine, everything that happened." Matthew looked up from his work. "I feel exactly what I should, satisfaction that justice was served. Anything else would be a waste of energy." But Mindy knew him too well to accept that. "You're not your father, Matthew. Being ruthless when necessary doesn't mean you have to be cold all the time." He considered this, remembering how Frederick's coldness had ultimately been his weakness, making him blind to the loyalty he'd inspired in people like Terry. "Perhaps," Matthew acknowledged, "but trust and emotion have to be earned. And have I earned them?" Mindy asked quietly. Matthew studied her for a long moment. She had stood with him through everything, had helped him plan and execute his revenge, had never once wavered in her support. "Yes," he said finally. "You have." The new penthouse was different from the one he had shared with Catherine. Modern, minimalist, uncluttered by false pretenses or hidden agendas. Matthew stood in his study, reviewing the latest reports from the foundation. In its first month of operation, the foundation had already received dozens of calls from whistleblowers, individuals with evidence of corporate corruption in need of protection and support. Matthew's mother sat in one of the leather chairs, discussing potential cases. Over the years of secret observation, she had gained invaluable insight into how corruption worked, how it could be detected, and how it could be exposed. This one, she said, highlighting a file. The pattern matches what Frederick used to do. Hidden accounts, phantom projects, missing funds. Matthew reviewed the details carefully. Have Blake look into it. If there's evidence, we'll move forward. Their working relationship had evolved into something new. It wasn't quite the mother-son bond they once shared, but rather a partnership based on shared purpose and mutual respect. Mindy entered with more files. Her presence now as natural in his home as it had been in his office. The DA's office called, she reported. They're using our investigation methods as a template for other cases. Apparently, we've created a new standard for exposing corporate fraud. Matthew allowed himself a small smile. What had begun as a personal vendetta had grown into something far larger. A systematic approach to fighting corruption, protecting whistleblowers, and holding the powerful accountable. Have you heard about Catherine? His mother asked cautiously. She's left the city, Matthew replied, his voice devoid of emotion. Blake's keeping tabs on her. She's staying with distant relatives, trying to rebuild her life. And Frederick? Still in prison. Still requesting meetings. Matthew's voice remained cold. Still not getting any response. The conversation shifted to more practical matters. New cases, potential investigations, and the growing influence of the foundation. Matthew remained focused, methodical. But there was something different now. His ruthlessness had found a new purpose. His determination was channeled into protecting others from the kind of betrayal he had experienced. As evening approached, his mother prepared to leave. At the door, she paused. You know, you've created something important here, she said. Something that could help a lot of people. Matthew nodded. That's the point. Every corrupt businessman, every fraudster, every betrayer should know they're not safe. That someone's watching, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike. After she left, Mindy joined him in the study. Their relationship had deepened over the months, built on a foundation of trust and understanding that neither of them took for granted. The foundation's getting another major donation, she reported. Apparently, your reputation for exposing corruption has made an impression. Good, Matthew replied. The more resources we have, the more cases we can take on. He turned away from his desk, looking at her directly. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything, for standing with me through all of this. Mindy met his gaze steadily. I believe in what you were doing. I still do. Their moment was interrupted by Blake calling with another potential case. More corruption, more people in need of help. Matthew listened carefully, already planning the investigation. This was his life now, not just as a lawyer or businessman, but as someone who had turned his own experience with betrayal into a weapon against corruption. He remained ruthless, calculating, and precise. But now, those traits serve a greater purpose. The sun had set over the city, yet Matthew continued to work. There were always more cases, more people in need of help, and more corruption to expose. He had found his true calling, not in revenge, but in justice, not in destruction, but in protection. He was no longer just the man who had destroyed his father's empire. He had become something more, a defender of those who couldn't defend themselves, a protector of those who dared to stand against corruption. The betrayal that had set him on this journey was behind him, yet its lessons remained. Trust had to be earned, loyalty had to be proven, and justice had to be pursued relentlessly. These were the principles he lived by, the standards he upheld, the legacy he was building. Matthew Whitehead had emerged from his father's shadow, not by becoming a different man, but by channeling his ruthlessness, precision, and determination into a cause greater than himself. He had taken everything his father had taught him about power and corruption and turned it into a weapon against those very things. This was his new dawn, not a softening of his nature, but a refinement of it. Not a change in who he was, but an evolution in how he used his skills. The ruthless lawyer who had once destroyed his father's empire had become something more, a guardian against corruption, a protector of the vulnerable, a force for justice in a world that desperately needed it. Epilogue. 5 years later, the Corporate Fraud Prevention Foundation's annual gala drew the city's elite. Business leaders, politicians, and journalists, all eager to show their support for the organization that had become the most feared watchdog in corporate America. In those 5 years, Matthew Whitehead's foundation had exposed dozens of corruption schemes, protected hundreds of whistleblowers, and fundamentally changed how corporate crime was investigated and prosecuted. Matthew stood at the podium, his presence commanding attention without effort. Age had only sharpened his features, adding gravitas to his reputation. The whispers in the crowd told the story. This was the man who had taken down his own father's corrupt empire, who had turned personal betrayal into a mission for justice. 5 years ago, he had begun. His voice carried across the silent room. I witnessed firsthand how corruption destroys not just businesses but lives. Today, we've helped recover over $2 billion in stolen funds and brought hundreds of white-collar criminals to justice. In the audience, Mindy Whitehead, who had married him 2 years after Frederick's conviction, watched her husband with pride. Their partnership had evolved from professional collaboration to personal connection, built on a foundation of absolute trust and shared purpose. She now served as the foundation's chief legal officer, her sharp instincts for deception complementing Matthew's strategic mind. After the speech, during the reception, Blake Sweeney approached with his latest report. The private investigator, now heading the foundation's investigation division, maintained his trademark precision and dry wit. Thought you want to see this, Blake said quietly, handing Matthew a file. Latest update on your father and Catherine. Matthew opened the file, reviewing its contents with clinical detachment. Frederick William, 5 years into his 25-year sentence, had aged dramatically in prison. His attempts to maintain influence through old business connections had failed. Matthew's foundation had systematically exposed and dismantled every remnant of his corrupt network. He's still requesting visits, Blake continued, monthly like clockwork. Same response as always, Matthew replied, closing the file. In 5 years, he had not once visited his father. Every letter, every request for contact had been logged and filed away unanswered. And Catherine? Blake pulled up another report on his tablet. Still in Seattle, working as a real estate agent under her maiden name. She's trying to rebuild her social connections there. But, he shrugged, your foundation's reputation makes people nervous. No one in the corporate world wants to be associated with anyone connected to the William case. The report included recent photographs. Catherine Prince, once the epitome of sophisticated beauty, now appeared worn. Her designer clothes had been replaced with off-the-rack business suits. The confident smile that once defined her now seemed careful, even hesitant. The miscarriage had left her unable to have children, a final twist of fate that destroyed her dreams of securing her future through motherhood. She's been seeing a therapist, Blake added. Apparently, she's trying to make amends. Wanted to write you a letter of apology. No contact. Matthew's voice was firm. Same as always. Across the room, Elizabeth Whitehead was engaged in a deep conversation with a group of corporate executives. Matthew's mother had found her calling as the foundation's chief advisor on detecting corporate fraud. Her years of secretly documenting Frederick's crimes had given her a unique insight into how corruption could be hidden behind respectable facades. Your mother's latest detection protocol is revolutionary, Blake remarked. 3 major firms have already adopted it. Matthew nodded with approval. His relationship with his mother had evolved into a powerful partnership. They never discussed Frederick directly, instead focusing on their shared mission of exposing corruption. It wasn't traditional maternal warmth, but it was something equally valuable: mutual respect and shared purpose. Terry Wilson, now the director of whistleblower protection, approached with her own update. The formerly timid assistant had transformed into a confident advocate, using her experience to help others escape abusive corporate environments. The Thompson case is ready to move forward, she reported. The evidence pattern matches exactly what we saw with your father's operations. Good, Matthew replied. Make sure the whistleblowers have full protection before we proceed. I want everything in place before we move. The evening continued, a celebration of the foundation's success and a warning to anyone who might consider following Frederick Williams' corrupt path. Matthew moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his reputation preceding him. Everyone knew his story. The ruthless lawyer who had destroyed his own father's empire rather than allow corruption to continue. Later that night, in their penthouse overlooking the city, Mindy found Matthew in his study, reviewing case files. "I saw the reports about Frederick and Catherine," she said, setting a coffee on his desk. "You okay?" Matthew looked up, his expression unchanged. "Why wouldn't I be? They're exactly where they deserve to be. Most people would feel something seeing their father age in prison. Most people didn't have a father who plotted their murder," Matthew replied coolly. "Frederick made his choices. So did Catherine. They're living with the consequences." Minnie understood. In 5 years of marriage, she had learned that Matthew's ruthlessness wasn't a facade or a response to trauma. It was his nature, tempered by principle rather than emotion. He had simply chosen to direct it toward protecting others, rather than pursuing personal vengeance. His phone buzzed. Another former associate of Frederick's had been indicted, their corruption exposed by the Foundation's investigation. Matthew allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Every conviction was another vindication of his methods, another proof that his father's way of doing business wouldn't be tolerated. The latest business news played on a screen in his office. Elias Lutz had been denied parole once again. The former politician had tried to rebuild his reputation through charitable work in prison, but Matthew's foundation had ensured that his corruption would not be forgotten. Blake mentioned that Catherine wanted to apologize, Mindy said cautiously. "There's nothing to apologize for," Matthew replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "She showed me who she really was. That knowledge was valuable." Indeed, Catherine's betrayal had taught him crucial lessons about trust and loyalty. Those lessons now served to protect others, helping him identify corrupt executives and corporate predators before they could ruin more lives. His mother had sent him an email about another potential case, another corruption scheme matching Frederick's old patterns. Even after 5 years, they were still uncovering traces of his father's influence in the business world. Each discovery reaffirmed Matthew's belief that his foundation's work was essential. A news alert flashed across the screen. Another wealthy businessman had been arrested, his corruption exposed by evidence gathered using the foundation's methods. Matthew had created something lasting, something that would continue to expose and punish betrayal long after the personal wounds that had inspired it had faded. "The Foundation's new training program launches next week," Mindy reminded him. "Law enforcement agencies from 3 countries are sending representatives." Matthew nodded with satisfaction. What had begun as personal revenge had evolved into a global mission. His father's betrayal had sparked something larger than himself, a systematic approach to fighting corruption that would endure beyond their lifetimes. In his private moments, Matthew sometimes reflected on the changes 5 years had brought. He had not softened. If anything, his reputation for ruthlessness had grown. But now that ruthlessness served a purpose beyond personal vengeance. He had transformed his pain into power, his betrayal into a weapon against corruption. Frederick William remained in his prison cell, his request for contact filed away, unread. Catherine Prince lived her quiet life in Seattle, her past following her like a shadow. They had betrayed him, plotted his destruction, and in return, he had ensured they would spend the rest of their lives living with the consequences of their choices. But their story had become just one case among many. Matthew's foundation now handled dozens of corruption cases, protected scores of whistleblowers, and exposed countless schemes. He had taken everything he had learned from destroying his father's empire and turned it into a methodology for fighting corruption worldwide. As the night deepened, Matthew continued to work. There were always more cases, more corruption to expose, more people to protect. He had built something that transcended personal revenge, a legacy of justice that would continue long after the personal wounds that had inspired it had faded into history. In the end, Frederick and Catherine's betrayal had given him something invaluable, a purpose, a mission, a way to turn his natural ruthlessness into a force for justice. They had tried to destroy him, and instead, they had helped create something indestructible. Matthew closed the final file and stood by the window, observing the city below. Somewhere out there, his father remained in his prison cell, and Catherine lived her diminished life, each of them burdened by the consequences of their choices. But he had moved beyond them, beyond revenge, beyond personal betrayal. He had become something greater than they could have ever envisioned. Not merely the son who had brought down his father's empire, but the man who had turned personal vengeance into a mission for justice. Their betrayal had ignited the spark, but his response had forged a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. The foundation would carry on its work, exposing corruption, safeguarding whistleblowers, and ensuring that those who betrayed trust would face the consequences. Matthew would continue leading it, his ruthlessness now tempered by purpose, his resolve focused on protection rather than revenge. It was, he mused, a fitting conclusion to their story. They had tried to destroy him through betrayal, but in the end, they had unwittingly helped create something that would dismantle corruption itself. In the end, that was the most fitting revenge of all. And so, our story concludes here. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel. Click on the video on the screen, and I'll see you there.